There's a curious paradox at the heart of modern life. We've been taught that avoiding conflict is a virtue, that the peaceful person, the one who never raises their voice or challenges the status quo, is somehow morally superior. We nod approvingly at those who keep the peace, who swallow their objections, who smile when they should scream. But what if I told you that this supposed virtue is actually a prison, and that the very thing we've been taught to admire is slowly eroding the essence of who you are? Today, we're going to explore an uncomfortable idea. Uncomfortable because it threatens the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about harmony and social grace. We're going to examine why your fear of confrontation isn't protecting you, but destroying you. And we're going to discover how a German philosopher who died over a century ago understood something about human nature that most of us are still too frightened to face. Let's begin with a simple observation. When did we decide that disagreement was inherently destructive? When did we conclude that the person who avoids all friction is somehow more enlightened than the one who stands their ground? If you examine your own behavior honestly, and I do mean honestly, you'll likely find a pattern. How many times this week have you bitten your tongue when someone said something you knew was wrong? How many times have you nodded along with an opinion that made your skin crawl? How many times have you chosen the path of least resistance, telling yourself you were being mature or diplomatic? This is what Friedrich Nietzsche would have recognized immediately as slave morality, the morality of the weak who have convinced themselves that their weakness is actually strength. The person who cannot bear confrontation doesn't possess some special wisdom about human relations. They possess fear, and they've dressed that fear up in the clothing of virtue. Consider the psychology at work here. When you avoid conflict, what are you really avoiding? You're avoiding the possibility of rejection, of being disliked, of having to defend your position with actual thought and conviction. You're avoiding the discomfort of discovering that your ideas might not be as solid as you believed, or worse, that you might have to change your mind. In short, you're avoiding growth. But there's something even more insidious happening. Each time you swallow your objection, each time you smile and nod when you should speak up, you're not just avoiding external conflict, you're creating internal conflict. You're splitting yourself in two. The person you present to the world and the person you actually are. Over time, this split becomes a chasm. The authentic self gets buried deeper and deeper beneath layers of agreeableness and social performance. This is what Nietzsche called ressentiment, a French word he borrowed because German wasn't quite venomous enough to capture the concept. Ressentiment isn't simple resentment. It's the slow burning hatred that develops when you consistently deny your own power, your own will, and your own truth. It's what happens when you turn your natural aggression inward instead of directing it outward toward the things that deserve to be confronted. The person consumed by ressentiment doesn't say, I disagree with you and here's why. They say, oh, you're probably right, and then spend the next 3 hours fantasizing about all the devastating comebacks they could have delivered. They don't challenge injustice when they see it. They comfort themselves with the thought that at least they're not the type of person who makes waves. They mistake their paralysis for nobility. Let's dig deeper into what happens to you, not society, not relationships, but you, when you make conflict avoidance your primary strategy for navigating the world. Every authentic self has edges. It has preferences that aren't universally shared, opinions that might offend, and boundaries that might inconvenience others. The process of smoothing away all these edges in service of perpetual harmony doesn't make you a better person. It makes you a less complete person. It makes you, in Nietzsche's terms, a fragment rather than a whole human being. Think about the people you genuinely admire, not the ones you're supposed to admire, but the ones who actually capture your imagination. I'll wager they're not the people who never caused any trouble. They're the people who stood for something, even when it was uncomfortable. They're the people who were willing to be disliked for their convictions rather than loved for their compliance. Now think about yourself. When was the last time you took a stand that genuinely cost you something? When was the last time you said no when yes would have been easier? When was the last time you defended an unpopular position simply because you believed it was right? If you're struggling to answer these questions, you're not alone. Most of us have been so thoroughly trained in the art of getting along that we've forgotten how to be genuine. We become what Nietzsche would call last men, creatures so devoted to comfort and safety that we've lost the capacity for greatness, for authentic self-expression, and for what he called the will to power. The will to power isn't about dominating others, despite what his detractors claim. It's about the fundamental drive to fully express your nature, to impose your vision on the world, to say this is who I am and this is what I believe, regardless of whether it makes others comfortable. It's the opposite of the cringing, apologetic existence that most of us have settled for. When you consistently avoid conflict, you're not just betraying your current self, you're limiting your future self. You're ensuring that you'll never develop the muscles of conviction, the skills of persuasion, and the confidence that comes from having tested your ideas against opposition and found them strong enough to survive. There's a particularly cruel irony here. The people who avoid conflict in order to maintain relationships often find that their relationships become increasingly shallow and unsatisfying. Why? Because intimacy requires authenticity, and authenticity inevitably involves some degree of friction. The person who agrees with everything has nothing interesting to say. The person who never challenges has nothing valuable to offer. So over time, you become a kind of human elevator music, pleasant enough background noise that no one really notices or remembers. Now we arrive at perhaps the most damaging consequence of conflict avoidance, the gradual acceptance of injustice, both personal and social. Injustice thrives in the absence of confrontation. Every tyrant, every bully, every system of oppression depends on the compliance of those who see what's happening but choose to look away rather than speak up. They depend on your politeness, your desire to avoid making a scene, your commitment to being liked above being right. On a personal level, this plays out in countless small compromises. You accept the friend who always cancels plans at the last minute because confronting them would be awkward. You tolerate the colleague who takes credit for your work because calling them out would create drama. You endure the family member who consistently crosses your boundaries because setting limits would cause problems. Each of these accommodations feels minor in isolation, but collectively they constitute a pattern of self-betrayal that slowly but surely teaches the world and teaches you that your needs, your standards, your dignity are negotiable. On a broader scale, societies that worship conflict avoidance become societies that tolerate the intolerable. They become places where injustice can flourish simply because no one wants to be the person who points it out. They become places where the loudest voice wins by default, not because their arguments are superior, but because everyone else has voluntarily muted themselves. Nietzsche observed this dynamic with particular clarity in his analysis of what he called herd morality, the tendency of groups to suppress individual excellence in favor of comfortable mediocrity. The herd doesn't want anyone to stand out, to challenge, to demand better. It wants everyone to get along, even if getting along means accepting conditions that are fundamentally unacceptable. This is why Nietzsche was so contemptuous of what he saw as Christian morality, not because he was opposed to compassion or kindness, but because he saw how these virtues had been weaponized to keep people passive in the face of suffering and injustice. Turn the other cheek sounds noble, but what if the person slapping you is a tyrant? What if your willingness to accept mistreatment enables them to mistreat others? There's a profound moral dimension to this that most conflict-avoidant people never consider. When you refuse to confront injustice, you become complicit in it. When you choose your comfort over someone else's dignity, you're making a moral choice, and it's not the virtuous one you think it is. The truly moral person, in Nietzsche's view, is the one who has the courage to say, "This is wrong, and I won't pretend otherwise." The truly moral person is willing to make others uncomfortable if that's what justice requires. They're willing to be seen as difficult, as troublesome, as someone who doesn't know when to let things go. This brings us to one of Nietzsche's most profound psychological insights, the concept of eternal recurrence. Imagine, he proposed, that you had to live your exact life over and over again, infinite times, making precisely the same choices, experiencing precisely the same consequences. How would this knowledge change the way you live? If you knew that every moment of cowardice, every swallowed objection, every time you chose comfort over courage would be repeated forever, would you still make the same choices? If you knew that your pattern of conflict avoidance would echo through eternity, would it still seem like the noble path? Eternal recurrence isn't meant to be taken literally, though Nietzsche sometimes suggested it might be. It's a psychological test, a way of measuring the weight and worth of your choices. It forces you to confront an uncomfortable question. Are you living a life you would willingly repeat forever? Or are you trapped in patterns you're ashamed of? Most people, if they're honest, would have to admit they're living lives they wouldn't want to repeat. They're making choices driven by fear rather than conviction, by social pressure rather than authentic desire. They're sleepwalking through existence, avoiding anything that might wake them up. The person who consistently avoids conflict is essentially saying, I would rather repeat this pattern of self-betrayal forever than risk a single moment of genuine confrontation. They're choosing an eternity of diminishment over the possibility of growth through struggle. But here's the beautiful thing about eternal recurrence. The moment you truly understand it, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to making unconscious choices, because every decision becomes weighted with the knowledge that this is what you're choosing to repeat forever. This is what Nietzsche meant when he talked about becoming who you are. It's not about discovering some pre-existing authentic self. It's about taking responsibility for creating yourself through your choices, moment by moment, decision by decision. It's about choosing to become someone whose life would be worth repeating. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes three metamorphoses of the spirit: the camel, the lion, and the child. Understanding these stages is crucial to understanding how one breaks free from the prison of conflict avoidance. The camel represents the first stage, the beast of burden who says, "What's the heaviest load you've got that I can carry?" The camel loads itself down with all the expectations, all the shoulds, all the social obligations that society piles upon it. The camel is the conflict avoidant person, taking on every burden to avoid having to say no, to avoid having to disappoint, and to avoid having to stand alone. The camel says, I must be agreeable. I must keep the peace. I must not rock the boat. I must make everyone else comfortable, even if it costs me my soul. The camel believes that carrying these burdens makes it virtuous, makes it strong. But the camel is strong in the way that a pack animal is strong. It can carry enormous weight, but it cannot choose its own direction. Then comes the transformation into the lion. The lion says, I will. Where the camel accepts every burden, the lion fights for the right to create its own values. The lion is the spirit that finally says, no, I will not accept this. No, I will not pretend to agree when I don't. This is the stage that most conflict-avoidant people fear above all else. They're terrified of becoming the lion because they've been taught that the lion is selfish, destructive, antisocial. They don't understand that the lion's apparent destructiveness is actually creative. It's destroying false values in order to make space for authentic ones. The lion stage is where you learn to fight. You learn to say no without apologizing. You learn to defend your position without crumbling under social pressure. You learn that you can survive being disliked, that you can endure conflict without being destroyed by it. Most importantly, you learn that standing up for yourself doesn't make you a monster, it makes you human. But the lion, necessary as it is not the final stage. The lion can destroy old values, but it cannot create new ones. For that, Nietzsche says, the spirit must become a child. The child represents holy innocence, forgetfulness, a new beginning. The child doesn't fight against the old values because it's moved beyond them entirely. It creates fresh values from its own nature, not in reaction to what came before, but from pure creative impulse. It is the person who has moved beyond the need to avoid conflict and beyond the need to seek it. The child speaks its truth not because it wants to fight, but because truth is its nature. It stands up for what's right, not out of anger or rebellion, but out of love for what could be. This progression from camel to lion to child is the path of authentic human development. Most people get stuck at the camel stage, loading themselves down with others' expectations and never learning to say no. Some make it to the lion stage and learn to fight, but they remain reactive, defined by what they're against rather than what they're for. The rare few who complete the metamorphosis become something new. Humans who can engage in conflict when necessary without being consumed by it, who can stand alone without being lonely, who can create values without imposing them on others. The journey begins with the recognition that you have been complicit in your own diminishment. Every time you swallowed your objection, every time you smiled when you wanted to scream, every time you've chosen comfort over courage, you participated in the construction of your own cage. This recognition is crucial because it shifts you from victimhood to agency. You're not trapped by external circumstances. You're trapped by your own choices. And what you have chosen, you can choose differently. The first practical step is to start noticing your patterns of avoidance. Begin to observe yourself with the detachment of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. When do you bite your tongue? What situations make you automatically switch into agreeable mode? What topics do you avoid because they might create friction? Notice the physical sensations that accompany your urge to avoid conflict. The tightness in your chest, the quickening of your pulse, the way your throat constricts when you're about to speak an unwelcome truth. These bodily responses are your early warning system. They're telling you that you're approaching something important. Once you've begun to map your avoidance patterns, you can start experimenting with small acts of authenticity, small, manageable challenges to your usual pattern of accommodation. Express a preference when someone asks where you want to eat instead of saying, I don't care. Disagree with a minor point in a conversation instead of nodding along. Set a small boundary with someone who habitually oversteps. Say no to a request that you would normally accept out of obligation. Pay attention to what happens. Notice that the world doesn't end when you express a contrary opinion. Notice that most people don't actually reject you for having preferences. Notice that standing up for yourself, even in small ways, creates a feeling of aliveness that compliance never could. As you build these muscles of authenticity, you'll start to discover something remarkable. Conflict isn't actually as dangerous as you thought it was. Most of the catastrophic outcomes you've been avoiding exist primarily in your imagination. The reality of disagreement is usually much more manageable than the fantasy of it. But here's where it gets interesting. As you become more willing to engage in surface-level conflict, you'll start to attract different kinds of relationships. People who are drawn to authenticity will be drawn to you. People who prefer compliant yes men will start to drift away. This sorting process can be painful, but it's also liberating. You're trading quantity for quality, superficial harmony for genuine connection. The next level involves learning to argue well. This is a skill that most conflict-avoiding people never develop because they've spent their lives avoiding the practice. Good argument isn't about winning or dominating. It's about the collaborative search for truth. It's about being willing to change your mind when presented with better evidence, while also having the conviction to defend your position when it's sound. Learn to separate the person from the position. You can disagree with someone's ideas without attacking their character. You can defend your own ideas without making the other person wrong for having different ones. This distinction is crucial for moving beyond the notion that disagreement equals hostility. Practice intellectual humility. Be willing to say, I don't know, when you don't know. Or, you've given me something to think about, when someone makes a good point. This isn't weakness. It's the confidence that comes from knowing you don't need to be right about everything to be worthy of respect. As you develop these skills, you'll find yourself naturally moving into the lion stage of development. You'll start to create your own values rather than simply accepting the ones handed to you. You'll discover that you have opinions about things you never thought about before. You'll find yourself caring about issues that you used to ignore because they seem too controversial. This is where the real work begins. The lion must learn to discriminate between battles worth fighting and windmills worth ignoring. Not every injustice requires your personal intervention. Not every wrong opinion needs your correction. The art is in choosing your conflicts wisely, engaging where you can make a difference, and letting go where you cannot. The mature lion understands that conflict is a tool, not an end in itself. The goal isn't to fight constantly, it's to live authentically. Sometimes authenticity requires confrontation. Sometimes it requires strategic silence. The difference is that now you're choosing silence from a position of strength rather than fear. And finally, if you persist in this work, you may find yourself approaching the child stage, that state of creative innocence that lies beyond both compliance and rebellion. The child doesn't avoid conflict out of fear and doesn't seek it out of anger. It simply expresses its nature as naturally as a tree grows toward the sun. When the child encounters resistance, it doesn't collapse or attack. It finds another way, or it waits, or it accepts that this particular expression isn't meant for this particular moment. This is true freedom, the ability to be yourself without apology, to speak your truth without aggression, to stand your ground without rigidity. This is what Nietzsche meant when he spoke of creating your own values, not imposing them on others, but living them so fully that they become a light for others to see by. The person who has completed this metamorphosis can engage in conflict when necessary because they're no longer afraid of it. They can also choose peace when appropriate because they're not driven by the need to prove themselves. They have nothing to prove because they know who they are. This is the great paradox. Only when you're willing to be disliked can you be truly loved. Only when you're willing to stand alone can you find genuine companionship. Only when you're willing to risk conflict can you create authentic peace. The path I've described isn't easy. It requires you to question everything you've been taught about virtue and social grace. It requires you to face the uncomfortable truth that your desire to be liked has been more important to you than your desire to be real. It requires you to accept that growth always involves some degree of destruction. The destruction of who you used to be to make room for who you're becoming. But the alternative is to remain in the prison of perpetual agreeableness, slowly suffocating under the weight of others' expectations, living a life so sanitized that it barely qualifies as living at all. So here's my challenge to you. Stop being afraid of conflict. Stop treating your authentic self as a dangerous animal that needs to be kept caged for the safety of others. Stop believing that your duty in this life is to make everyone else comfortable at the expense of your own truth. The world doesn't need another person who smiles and nods and agrees to keep the peace. The world needs you, the real you, with all your inconvenient opinions and uncomfortable truths and unwieldy edges. The world needs what you have to offer, but it can only receive it if you're brave enough to offer it. Remember Nietzsche's test of eternal recurrence. If you had to live this exact life over and over again, making these same choices, experiencing these same patterns of self-betrayal, would you be willing, or would you choose differently? The beautiful thing about this moment, this precise moment in which you're hearing these words, is that you can choose differently. You can decide that the person you've been is not the person you have to remain. You can decide that your fear of conflict has controlled you long enough. The metamorphosis begins with a single word, no. No, I will not pretend to agree when I don't. No, I will not accept treatment that diminishes me. No, I will not sacrifice my authentic self on the altar of social harmony. And from that first authentic no, the rest of your life begins. Not the life you inherited, not the life others expect of you, but the life you create through the courage of your convictions and the strength of your authentic voice. This is your invitation to break free. The cage door has always been open. The only question that remains is whether you're ready to walk through it. Thanks for watching. If this video spoke to you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next.